inviting me, and I'm really sorry that I haven't been able to be here the whole time. That was my intention, but I had a diary clash in that I was asked to be the guest speaker at a high school that my daughter goes to, and I had to give that priority. I have to say that it's much more intimidating speaking to 500 teenage girls, and I feel a lot more confident in this space than I did yesterday. But I am sorry that I wasn't able to be here yesterday and the day before, just to connect up with the other keynote speakers, so that I could get a better sense of the discourse of this conference. So I hope that what I'm speaking to today will resonate or bounce off in some way what has been discussed so far in the conference, and that you can pick up on those things. As has already been said, I'm speaking about broadly this issue of vocational education and training. I've focused in the last couple of years particularly on the FET college sector, and I know that some of the students here are looking at the issue of vocational education and the FET colleges, and it's an emerging field in South Africa and becoming a lot more studied and interrogated. And I think what I'm going to try and do today is to speak to some connections back to the field of education, and argue that we mustn't allow the field of vocational education to wander too far away from the field of education. How does one move things along like that? So that's the title. The picture that's in the background there, and I'll come back to that later, is a picture from the 1920s where white mine workers were protesting about a threat to their jobs, and they were specifically arguing for job reservation and to protect skilled white workers, because the mines were wanting to bring in both cheap Chinese labor that was skilled, but also increasingly bringing in black labor into the mines and undermining the position of the skilled mine workers. And I think some of the debates that I'm going to be speaking to resonate with that history. But the issue of the connection between education and the economy in South Africa is something that appears on a daily basis in the press, and there isn't a week where one of our politicians isn't making a statement or releasing a report that speaks to the centrality of the role of education in dealing with a range of social problems, and particularly the question of economic productivity in this country. So this is a statement from about 2 weeks ago, our Deputy President speaking at Wits University. And you can see quite clearly here that the central concern around poverty is the solution to that particular problem is us, the education system. We have to sort out poverty. If we don't have the right education system, we're not going to be able to sort out poverty, and linked to the question of poverty is all sorts of social concerns around the structure of our society. And so the pressure that we are under as educationists to solve social problems is enormous. And this isn't just in the political discourse, it's also on a daily basis in our newspapers. Here's a column from yesterday's newspaper, Peter Delmar talking about the failure of the education system to produce enough engineering skills. And from, I think on Monday, is it the 14th? So it really is every day. You don't have to do much research to see this discourse coming through. The skills shortage being the central problem. That Africa, not just South Africa, is growing economically, and the thing that's holding that economic growth back is the question of skills. And it's our fault because we're not training people properly. What's interesting in this particular article is that, and this is where I wish I'd got my act together and used Prezi instead of PowerPoint, because then you could zoom in like Wayne's one bit. There's a little comment in there that says, from the authors of the report that they're citing, saying that in fact the skills are there. It's absorbing them into the economy that is the issue. Now it's interesting because that's not what the headline is telling you or what the rest of the article is telling you. But the research that this report is based on is saying that there are skilled people out there. It's getting them into the economy that's the problem. All the rest of the article quotes CEOs and executives of companies who say that the skills shortage is the problem that they face. But when one looks at the actual data, this question of the skills shortage starts unraveling a little bit, and I'll come back to that a bit later in the presentation. So we have a situation where South Africa has massive unemployment, 28% according to this Ipsos survey, and it's very similar to pretty much every other data set, whether we're talking about the census or Stats SA or the household surveys. It's always around this, and it has been hovering around that or worse since we started collecting data after 1994. So almost a third of our population is unemployed and actually looking for work, and less than 40% have any form of employment at all. That's very low. Of course, the difference between those two figures is also would be the people who've either given up looking for work entirely, or people who are in education, are too young to work or too old to work. But interestingly, these kinds of figures used to be incredibly alarming. Now they don't look all that different to countries like Spain, Greece, Portugal, even places like Ireland have figures that are not that far off from this. So we're talking not just about a South African problem, we're talking about a global and a growing global problem. And every single report, every single research report, every single stats report speaks about this centrality of this problem of unemployment and job creation as the biggest problem that South Africa faces. In the last couple of years, we started talking about this group, the NEETs. It's a term that we've borrowed from the UK, those that are not in employment, education, or training. And we're specifically talking about people who are under 25 in that kind of category. And the estimates for South Africa, and it's difficult to tell, the data has been contested, but it's certainly a large number of people. But the data varies between 1.5 million and 3.5 million young people who are sitting outside of any form of employment, education, or training at the moment. And this is something that Guy Standings speaks about as the new dangerous class, what he terms the precariat. Not the proletariat, the precariat, because they make societies precarious. And you can see that there's a lot of concern in the context of the launches of political parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters, for instance, which speak exactly to this constituency. So small wonder then that politicians are anxious to try and solve this problem. And the solution, as I've already suggested, is this thing that we now in South Africa are calling VSET. It used to be called TVET or VET or FET, basically vocational education and training. We've now inserted into it continuing as well, and there's a significance to that. But VSET or TVET has become, particularly since the Zuma administration, the post-Polokwane administration has entered into power, has really become a central plank of policy, but it was very much there prior to that. So since 1994, this has been continually presented as the solution to most of the social problems in South Africa. But as I've suggested, it isn't a South African phenomenon. We're very much part of a trend internationally. So UNESCO, the World Bank, the IMF are all promoting similar agendas, agendas that had died back in the 1970s, and there'd been a focus on education for all at a primary level. There's now much more emphasis on higher education and training and vocational education. The 2013 BRICS summit that happened in Durban recently, earlier this year, had for the first time a special commission on vocational education and training, and they've got people working from all the BRICS countries around that field and sharing resources. And there's growing moves to try and develop comparative instruments to test, like TIMSS and Pearl, to compare countries in terms of their vocational systems and so on. So what I'm suggesting is that this has been a major feature of our educational reform, but it's been a relatively under-theorized and understudied part of the system. We've tended, particularly in faculties of education, to focus on the schooling system and the curriculum reforms that have happened there, and the vocational system has been through major changes, but it's something that we haven't tried to understand terribly well. And when you look at the policy reforms from the early 1990s to now, there's a constant refrain and rationale that argues that the vocational education system must be changed in order to make the graduates that come out of it more employable, and that the system must become more responsive. And it's that I want to try and focus on today. You can see that it's supposed to be a kind of going back into the past, but also thinking about the future. I want to draw on a concept called future history, which is from literary studies, which some curriculum theorists have drawn on to try and argue that we need to, when we look historically back at what's happened, we need to spend a bit more time trying to understand what people were imagining about the future at that point in time, rather than looking at the failures of the system or the errors that people made. What was it that people actually thought they were doing at the point when policies were implemented? So I want to spend a few minutes just going back to the early 1990s, the late 1980s, in fact, where all of this started, and think about how that system was imagined at that point, and then talk about what's happened subsequently. And the first point to note is that, in fact, the design of our education system as a whole was shaped very much by a vision that wasn't driven by educationists. And the very first educational act that was passed, and it was one of the first acts of the new democratic parliament, so it was a major priority, was actually put forward by the Department of Labor, not the Department of Education, but it drove the agenda for vocational education, but also for all of us, for the whole education system, because as a consequence of this idea of having the whole of the education system integrated into one single vocational, qualification framework, the NQF, which is represented graphically here, that drove a lot of the curriculum reform that affected the schooling system. The introduction of outcomes-based education was a consequence of the kind of logic of this type of system, and we still sit with those consequences today. But the reason this was introduced was in order to allow someone to move between all these different bands and streams that are represented here. So what was imagined by the architects of the system was that all knowledge would be pinned to this framework at particular levels, and that it would be defined in terms of its level and in terms of its credits, and that you would be able to be assessed against the specified outcomes that were there. And the original intention was that everything would be on this framework, whether we're talking about unit standards in coffin making, or your Bachelor of Arts degree, or your school certificates, your adult basic certificates, or your doctorates, your vocational programs that were in colleges, or vocational programs in the workplace. Everything would be specified on this national qualification framework, and people would be able to gather credits over the course of their life and would be able to move freely between these different levels. It was driven by a principle of integration. So, and the integration was that we needed to integrate both academic and vocational education. We needed to make sure that there was articulation between all those different levels and streams, and we needed to make sure that knowledge was integrated within that framework. And of course, there was also the history of South Africa and the issue of the integration of people, and that was a central strand that ran through the logic of this framework. And that last point around the people also underpinned some of the principles around learner-centeredness, because that was linked to ideas of democracy and moving away from the kind of hierarchical notions that were associated with the old system. And that logic, if you have everything specified on that framework, then means that you have to specify what the outcomes are that people have to achieve. And that's a logic that comes from vocational qualification frameworks from Australia and New Zealand and Scotland at the time, which we borrowed from. And that then meant, because everything was on the same system, meant that we had to have outcomes for the schooling system and the university system as well. And that's when the contestation started, of course, and we know that history, so I'm not going to go into that here. But they are very much connected to each other. So once that framework had been put in place, there was an enormous amount of reform that happened from the mid and the late 1990s onwards, and it's ongoing. And as I've said, it's not something that we have studied very much, but there is a growing body of literature now that addresses reform. But just in broad strokes, and some of you would be more familiar with this than others, the scale of the institutional reform makes the mergers of universities and all the debates around that really seem quite minor, because we had 150 technical colleges that were merged into 50 mega FET institutions. There was, just in the first phase, 15 billion rand spent on infrastructure development in those FET colleges, and subsequently there have been 3 further waves of investment, so that the total now that's been spent on infrastructure and equipment investment in the colleges has been of the order of 150 million now, 150 billion rand. There's been curriculum reform that is easily as complex and as contested as the introduction of the outcomes-based system, Curriculum 2005, and all the various iterations of that in the schooling system. And particularly the introduction of the National Certificate Vocational has been a highly contested process, and there's been a lot of resistance to that curriculum from industry and from participants in the college system, so much so that in the last year, we've had a ministerial review underway, and the minister has committed himself and, in fact, has already reintroduced old courses that had been removed from the college curriculum because of pressure from industry. So there's been a lot of activity, but the successes have been few. Certainly if you listen to what government itself says about the college system. These are not critical academics outside of the system. These are the people who are actually responsible for the system, writing about the system recently. And this is the Department of Higher Education and Training. That's the authority that is responsible for colleges. They say FET colleges are varied and diverse, but with some notable exceptions, they are mainly weak institutions. With their present capacity, colleges can neither absorb significantly large numbers of students nor achieve acceptable levels of throughput. And the National Development Plan says a very similar thing, and it argues for major reforms in the college system and ends by saying that we need to change the system, the quality of the system, in order to improve the employability of the graduates. And this has been the case. If you go through, and this talk is based on a chapter that's going to be in a book that Salim Vali and Ember Mutala are editing that's going to come out early next year. If people would like it, I can make that chapter available to you. There's a lot more detail about the actual the phases of reform that have happened in the college system. But through every 3 or 4 year cycle, and it's literally that often, there's some review of the college system and they make the same point. And it's been going on like that since 1994, when the first initial documents were produced. The first green paper on FET, for instance, makes that point. We're sitting now in 2012, and the same points are being made by government. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a problem, obviously, in the colleges, but there might also be a problem in the way in which we're looking at this, and that we might need to take on a different set of lenses to make sense of what's going on. And part of the problem is that this focus on the colleges and the education system always looks at the endogenous characteristics of the system itself, and to some extent the wider state. But it doesn't locate that within the wider context, the kind of context that I was trying to refer to earlier, and how that context actually makes it almost impossible for the colleges to do what people say they should do. So what I want to do in the next part of this presentation is just to look at take a couple of different lenses at it and just try and explore some of the complexity of what's going on in the vocational education system. But I want to start with the South African Qualification Authority's own rationale for the NQF, to go back to the NQF and just look at what they said when the NQF was established. What is this thing about? And I'm sorry, there are 3 slides because I thought this text is actually really interesting and it's worth putting up there in full for you to read. But I'm just going to pick out a... Can you read that? Yeah. I'm not going to read it all, but the key theme that comes through is that this this qualifications framework is there in order to make South Africa competitive. That we need to compete in this global economic environment. So it speaks to the context of globalization coming South Africa's way post-1994, as our barriers started opening up and we were exposed to that neoliberal globalized world. It recognizes that. But what its strategy is, the way we're going to deal with those globalized forces is to produce more effective and adaptable people. And we want a national education and training system that is responsive to ever-changing influences and to this external environment. And so it introduces concepts like lifelong learning. And when it speaks in this rationale about learners here, it speaks about these learning pathways that are made possible through this national qualifications framework. But the learning pathways are there to improve and increase employment opportunities. And again, it reiterates the success of the nation being able to compete in this global community. Can I move on? And the third one, citing Christopher, the other Ball, not Stephen Ball, Christopher Ball, talking about how we need to produce these people called flexible generalists. And again, lifelong learning comes through, talking about multiple career changes, education for employability, and supporting an adaptable workforce. This is the qualification authority of our entire education system, and the entire rationale of that system is all about employability and competitiveness, flexibility, and so on. There's nothing there that's bar a few references to things like creativity, but even those references to creativity are in relation to being creative in the context of employability. The whole education system, the rationale for the qualifications framework, is driven by this idea of employability and about the system being responsive to that. So we need to really try and interrogate, what does it mean when we're talking about responsiveness, and what does it mean when we talk about employability? Where do these ideas come from? So responsiveness is something that has been around for a long time. Certainly in the research that I've done, you can go back to the 1970s, and in documents available at that time, they were already critiquing technical colleges in terms of their ability to respond to the workplace. So that's 40-odd years ago, more. And if one goes wider than South Africa, you'll see that critique has been there even longer. So education systems are always being criticized for not being responsive to the workplace. We're always being told, particularly that vocational education is too much like school, that it's outmoded, and that it's disconnected from the workplace. And it's been like that for the last 40 years. And that because of the rapid changes that exist in the economy and in technology and so on, we have to be much more adaptable, and we have to respond to the demands of employers. And so the solution to that problem is invariably that we need closer linkages and partnerships with employers. That's the responsiveness agenda. This issue of employability is, to some extent, the flip side, that if the colleges, if their job is to be more responsive, then what they've got to do is to produce people who are more employable. But when you actually look at what employability means, it focuses on the product of the system, the individual that comes out, and there's a strong emphasis on what the needs of the employer are. And it often becomes a kind of checklist of particular attributes. So we've been doing some work in agri-business, sugar and forestry particularly. And just have a look at this particular advert for a senior forester in mechanized harvesting. It specifies a few things in terms of your qualifications that you need. You need a particular diploma, and this is for a person who's going to work with these huge machines that are able to harvest 10 trees at the same time. So you don't need individual people with chainsaws cutting down trees. So you're wanting somebody who's going to work with those machines, and then you have a look at the competences that are required for this job. I think if you're driving one of those machines, you've got a lot of influence and persuasion if you're standing on the ground. Yeah. But nothing in that list of key competences has got anything specific to do with forestry at all. So if you're at Sarsfield at NMNU's college that teaches for the forestry industry, and you had a look at this, you would think, well, maybe our curriculum should all be about group work and systems thinking and putting people through perseverance programs. But that is, in fact, when you look at lists of employability skills, they invariably are these generic sets of skills around the self-management, would be generic IT type skills, so language ability, communication ability, numeracy, and so on. The actual task-related knowledge often disappears within this discourse around employability. So there's this growing pressure now on educational institutions to produce these people who have these very complex, rounded sets of generic skills. But as soon as you develop any curricula that tries to begin to address any of that, then the employers will come back at you and tell you that you're producing people who can't actually do the basics of the job. And you need to get on with that as well. Now, the French philosopher and theorist Luc Boltanski has argued that this notion of employability has emerged as the nature of our work has shifted over the last 30 or 40 years. And he's obviously talking about a French context, but he's arguing that employment and work used to be understood primarily in terms of a notion of security, that once you got into a particular job, you were within a particular firm, and that firm would expect loyalty from you, and you would get certain things in return, but there was a clearly mapped out career path for you within that context, and that relationship would be backed up by the state in terms of providing basic health care, pension, and so on. So that there was a large amount of security in the post-war period from the 1950s until the 1970s. And then things started breaking down, and there are a number of reasons why that has happened. But there's been this increasing shift globally towards focusing on the autonomy of the individual and defining work both within and between companies more and more as projects. So many modern companies now don't employ you in a particular position. They employ you as part of a team to take on a particular project, and then that team gets reconstituted when a new project emerges. So your responsibility within that situation increases because you're no longer on a path that's fairly clearly defined, and that if you take certain steps, you will move along it. You now have to be much more aware of yourself within the context of the world of work. And Boltanski calls it the projective self, from project, not projecting forward, but it is also about projecting yourself forward and thinking about where your next move is going to be and how you position yourself to get into those situations. So the individual has to manage and mobilize their personal capital, these kind of generic skills, and then your specific skills to position yourself so that you improve your employability by moving from one project to the next. And the responsibility of education then is to kind of give you the resources through processes of lifelong learning and articulation, and that allows for that mobility. So the system allows for you to navigate through it. And the kind of people that that companies want are in fact people who are able to scan the environment to learn what kinds of jobs are available and what skills are required by them in order to get those jobs. Those are what Fugate says are people who have high employability. They're able to actually see where things are heading. And it's their responsibility. They take on the responsibility to develop their own skills through processes of self-reflection and so on. So the shift that's happened with this discourse of employability is that the responsibility for employment is no longer primarily the responsibility of the society as a whole, or the state, or a social compact between business and labor, for instance. The responsibility is very much on you. And if you fail, it's your fault. So we've got the education system that's responsible, and what they have to do is to provide people with the skills that enable them to individually scan the environment and to find how to position themselves. So this focus of employability is one that's very much on the supply side. What colleges are going to put out there into the system, and the individuals and how they move through the system. So the debates happen within that kind of context are about exactly the balance of these different dispositions and personal characteristics and how you build those into the curriculum. But the supply side focus doesn't ask questions about whether in fact the work is actually there. And what we're seeing globally is that there's less and less work actually. So the work that exists is increasingly hollowed out in terms of its complexity. So the kinds of jobs that people used to do, which required a lot of judgment and located responsibility at a local level, are increasingly hollowed out in terms through technology, for instance. So if you think about the status of a bank manager 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and now, it's been a massive hollowing out. Now, somebody who sits in a local branch and interviews you about whether you get a bond has to make no judgment whatsoever. They just have to input data into a computer that runs an algorithm, and then the computer will tell you this person's low risk, high risk, whatever. There's no judgment that happens in that process anymore. And so those kinds of jobs increasingly don't even require people. You can just do them online and enter the data yourself. And so there are fewer and fewer jobs, actually, through lean production systems. If we compare a mine like Marikana, the Lonmin mine in Marikana, which I think had something like 30,000 people employed. Similar mine in Australia will have 10% of the number of people. So you'll have a few highly skilled people working underground, highly paid, doing a complex set of jobs, but there are only 300 of them that are needed to do exactly the same thing. And this is an increasing trend, and it's something that employers find attractive because computers don't go on strike. Well, some of them. But, so there is another way of looking at employment, which would be to focus more on the demand side. To what extent does one create facilitated mechanisms that allow people to access jobs and to allow those kinds of things? And there are initiatives. South Africa has had programs, and there are countries where there's very strong social contract between business and labor, for instance. I'm thinking particularly Germany often comes up as an example there, where there's a very strong social contract between unions and business in terms of making sure that people are trained and brought into positions. But even there, those things are starting to break down. And our own attempts at this, things like the Extended Public Works Program and learnerships and that, have consistently shown that there is very little actual real work at the end of periods of work exposure. So people do short-term, low-paid work. They get a bit of money in, but they can't use that experience or those skills to access any other kind of work. And that's primarily because it actually isn't there. So a political economy lens on this problem would suggest something quite different, that it's not a fault of the education system itself, and it's not the institutions that are failing. And I'm not suggesting that things couldn't be improved in terms of the learning and teaching and all sorts of things within the college sector. I'm not saying that at all. But even if we got those colleges running absolutely brilliantly and we had the best teachers in the system, we wouldn't necessarily be able to ensure that people are actually getting into employment. Because this idea of a skill shortage, when you actually interrogate the data, is all about the perception of CEOs and human resource officers. And when you interrogate what they mean when they say they can't find the right people to employ, it actually starts unraveling fairly quickly. So when we say that we don't have enough engineers, we don't have enough engineers in the frame that they might be looking for, but there's a lot of engineers who are actually struggling to find work and who leave the country and find work in other countries because they can't get employment here. So there's a structural problem in the economy and the way the economy works that a political economy lens will illuminate and suggest that the problem is not an education problem necessarily. But I want to go back also because there's another way of looking at this which I think needs to be foregrounded, and it speaks back to that photograph right at the beginning. That, and this is a more sociogenetic lens, drawing on people like Norbert Elias's work and so on, where one tries to understand how over long periods of time, in the long durée, particular patterns and systems and ways of thinking about the world have embedded themselves in particular societies. And you can't just introduce reform and think that we're going to take a vocational system like Germany's, for instance, and try and run it in South Africa, when we have the kind of history that we have where labor, manual labor particularly, and creative work has been stigmatized both in the kind of British colonial class system and then overlaid with the very racialized apartheid history that we have. J.M. Coetzee in his, I think it was in Boyhood, talks about it as the taboo of manual labor in the way, and he likens it to the taboo of the caste system in India. And I think there's a real truth to it. You look at the inverted pyramid in terms of applications of people coming into particular types of programs, and South Africans are desperate to get into white-collar jobs, even when those white-collar jobs are really mundane jobs, sitting, punching data into a computer. People will choose to do that rather than to do a well-paid and potentially very creative but manual job that requires them to work with an engine or work with plumbing or carpentry or technology. So we have this structural inverted pyramid in South Africa that can't just be a problem of the education system, and it's not something that is resolved by changing the curriculum. So then, and I am coming to an end, what are we responding to when we are told to respond? I'm saying that we can't be responding just to industry. Employers don't have actually a wider social understanding of what the needs of the society are as a whole. And they often don't even have an understanding of the needs of their own industry, because they're not necessarily thinking about what the next steps are. They're thinking about who we need next week to do the jobs that we've got at the moment. Some are thinking a little bit more forward, but do they have the kind of wider concerns of the society as a whole? Are they concerned about the environment, for instance? Are they concerned about the needs of the individuals? if you have a look at this employment contract from a company that I've anonymized here, but this is a genuine contract. It said company's talent strategy is driven by the need to provide the business with a constant and consistent pipeline of skilled external individuals. Can you do a discourse analysis of this? What's an external individual? Anyway, to ensure continuity, sustainability, and profitability. So the company graduate program is intended to act as a vital talent acquisition strategy, acquisition component through which the strategic imperative can be achieved. And then they'll also bring in, the existing individuals that are in the company will be identified and developed through a robust talent program. And this is the discourse out there in industry. It's also coming into the university sector because this is exactly what our UKZN talent management strategy says. But this isn't UKZN, but it's close. Do you want these people to define what goes into a curriculum? No, not sure. So I think maybe I was going to talk a little bit about knowledge, but I think you've probably had quite a lot of talk about knowledge over the last 2 days. So let me not, there are connections, I think, particularly to the other two keynote speakers in this domain. But what I think I'd like to end with then is to say that I think that there's still a really important role for formal education, because what happens in formal education is a space that doesn't happen in on-the-job training and work-based learning and so on. And I think it's really critical that educationists think about this space and what needs to be inserted into the curriculum and the pedagogy within what we call vocational education and training. That the argument that Stephanie Allais is making in this particular quote is that we actually need to strengthen the educational side of vocational education. We need strong curricula. We need better understanding of the knowledge systems that underpin the world of work. But we also need to, and I think we need to give students a better sense of the world in which they're working in, so that they can see where they are positioned within this. And that requires us to start thinking about vocational education, and I won't go into explaining this, but essentially what it draws on, again, drawing on Boltanski, is to say we've got to shift vocational education out of what Boltanski talks about as the market city, the discourse that frames vocational education purely in terms of the market, and to reinsert it into discussions drawing on other cities, essentially orders of worth. I don't know, Wayne, did you talk to some of that? Yeah. Okay. So the inspirational city, the civic city, that will shift the way we think about vocational education, so that we can start shaping that field in terms of the knowledge and the capabilities, that we make sure that our vocational system doesn't look like that. Okay. Thank you very much.